Welcome to Articles About Revenge, the home of stories where justice is served and resilience is the ultimate reward. We specialize in narrating the most gripping accounts of individuals who were underestimated, overlooked, and betrayed, only to rise from the ashes and claim their power. You won't want to miss a single second of today's video because the twist at the end is as satisfying as it is shocking. Stay tuned until the very last word. And now, without further ado, here is our story. They threw me away for being broken 8 years later. I returned as a federal honoree. The heavy bulletproof glass doors of the FinCEN headquarters in Washington, D.C. hissed open, and for a moment the frantic hum of the nation's capital seemed to vanish. I stepped onto the polished marble floor, the sharp, rhythmic click of my heels echoing against the high ceilings. I was dressed in a charcoal gray tailored suit, my back perfectly straight, and the gold-embossed Federal Special Agent badge pinned to my lapel caught the harsh fluorescent light. This clinical filtered air conditioning was a universe away from the suffocating humid heat of the Louisiana swamplands, where I had been discarded like a piece of faulty machinery 26 years ago. I looked toward the third row of the observation gallery. There they were. Three faces I had spent 8 years trying to scrub from my memory. I saw a man, a retired timber magnate whose pride was as brittle as dry bark, lean over to the woman beside him. He let out a sharp, mocking huff of air, a sound I knew all too well. I didn't need to hear his words to know what he was whispering. Look at her, still trying to play the hero with that limp. The woman, a socialite who had always preferred a perfect image over a fractured daughter, just adjusted her pearls and looked away, her face twisting into that familiar expression of cold, public embarrassment. I ignored the sting, my eyes fixed forward as I took my seat at the lead investigator's table. The atmosphere in the room was thick, charged with the kind of tension that precedes a lightning strike. In the center of it all sat a younger man, his expensive silk tie loosened his hands, trembling just enough for me to notice. He was the golden boy. The visionary they had poured every cent and every ounce of love into, while I was left to rot in a flooded basement. The presiding federal director stepped to the podium, his voice booming through the silent hall. Case File Alpha 9, the United States versus Spencer Franklin. Charges: racketeering, wire fraud, and high-level financial misconduct. He paused, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on me. He didn't just nod. He stopped entirely, a look of profound professional reverence crossing his face. Special Agent Jocelyn Franklin. He whispered into the microphone, the sound vibrating through the gallery. The architect of Operation Black Tide. We are ready for your testimony. In that instant, the mocking sneer on the man in the third row evaporated. The woman's pearls seemed to choke her. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was the sound of a family's entire reality shattering into a million jagged pieces. They had spent my whole life telling me I was a footnote, a mistake that needed to be hidden away. They had no idea that while they were laughing at my perceived imperfections, I was busy writing the end of their heritage. If you have ever been cast aside by the very people who were supposed to protect you, only to rise stronger than they could ever imagine, then you belong here. This story is for the warriors who built their own thrones from the debris of betrayal. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to witness the ultimate federal exposure. In this community, we don't just tell stories, we deliver justice. The damp smell of mildew and the relentless rhythmic dripping of water in the Franklin basement were the only consistent companions I had throughout my formative years in Louisiana. While the upper floors of our colonial-style home groaned under the weight of expensive mahogany furniture and the boisterous laughter of high society guests, the world beneath the floorboards was a dark, humid sanctuary of neglect. My bedroom wasn't a room at all. It was a converted storage nook located right next to the industrial water heater, a place where the air was always thick enough to taste like rust. My parents, Franklin Sr. And Priscilla had decided very early on that my physical limitations, the twisted curvature of my spine, and the way my left leg dragged behind me like a stubborn anchor, were an affront to the family image. To them, I was a manufacturing error that needed to be tucked away in the shadows so the rest of the world could focus on their masterpiece, my older brother Spencer. Spencer was treated like a deity in a three-piece suit, the favored child, whose every action was heralded as a sign of future greatness. I remember a specific Tuesday evening when the house was filled with the savory, buttery aroma of local cuisine. Up in the dining room, the chandelier was dimmed just right, and Priscilla was likely fussing over the placement of the silver spoons, making sure everything was perfect for Spencer's celebration. He had just received a participation trophy for a junior debate club, and in our house, that was treated with the same reverence as winning a top academic prize. Franklin Sr. had even uncorked a vintage wine, his booming voice vibrating through the vents as he toasted to the future titan of industry. Meanwhile, I sat on a milk crate in the basement, the cold concrete floor seeping through my thin stockings, staring at a chipped porcelain plate that had been slid onto the top step of the stairs like a peace offering to a stray dog. On it sat a few cold, hardened crusts of bread and a pile of scraps. It was a dark joke, the Franklin version of a balanced meal for the daughter they hoped would eventually just disappear. I didn't cry that night. I had long since run out of tears, realizing that self-pity was a luxury for those who were actually seen. Instead, I pulled my beat-up second-hand laptop, a machine I had salvaged from a dumpster, and rebuilt piece by piece onto my lap. The screen flickered with a greenish hue, but to me it was a portal to a world where my leg didn't matter and my spine was as straight as a line of code. While Spencer was upstairs being pampered, I was teaching myself the intricacies of global financial flows and the hidden architecture of the digital world. It was almost comical to listen to Franklin Sr. explain the complexities of interest rates to a teenage Spencer who was clearly more interested in checking his hair in the reflection of a silver butter knife, while I was downstairs silently identifying a series of suspicious offshore transactions just for practice. My father often said that Spencer had the mind of a lion, failing to realize his lion couldn't even balance a checkbook without Priscilla's help, while the girl in the basement was already miles ahead of them both. The dynamic was so absurdly lopsided that it bordered on a dark comedy. Priscilla would often come to the top of the basement stairs, her voice high-pitched and strained with a performative kindness that never quite reached her eyes. "Jocelyn, dear, be a sweetheart, and don't make too much noise tonight." She would call down, her expensive perfume wafting through the doorway like a fragrant insult. "Spencer is trying to visualize his future empire, and the sound of you moving around down there is distracting his creative flow." I would simply hum a response, watching the shadows of their feet move across the sliver of light at the top of the stairs. It was as if they believed my very existence was a form of static that interfered with the broadcast of Spencer's glory. Once during a particularly heavy rainstorm, when the basement floor was covered in 2 inches of murky water, Spencer actually had the audacity to lean over the railing and toss a handful of soggy popcorn down at me, laughing about how I was the lady of the lake. Franklin Sr. had just chuckled from the hallway, telling Spencer not to tease the help before ushering him away. Despite the dampness and the isolation, the basement became my laboratory of resentment and ambition. I didn't need their mahogany tables or their vintage wines. I had the cold, hard logic of numbers. I began to track the family's finances out of sheer boredom, and what I found was a revelation that made me smirk into the darkness. While my parents were pouring every available dollar into Spencer's business ventures, the actual foundation of the Franklin wealth was starting to crack. They were so blinded by their own narrative of perfection that they couldn't see the disaster looming on the horizon. I watched as they took out a second mortgage just to pay for Spencer's 21st birthday bash, a party I wasn't allowed to attend, because, as Priscilla put it, it wouldn't be fair to the guests to see someone so sickly on such a joyous occasion. Every night, as the water dripped and the heater hummed, I built my own empire in the digital void. I became a ghost in the machine, a silent observer of a world that had rejected me. I knew the exact moment Spencer's vanity would lead him into the arms of federal investigators, though he was too arrogant to realize he was being watched, even then. I was learning the language of consequences while my family was still speaking the language of ego. The sheer irony of my situation wasn't lost on me. The girl hidden in the basement was the only one in the house who truly understood the price of the life they were leading. They saw a burden, but I was becoming a predator, sharpening my intellect like a blade in the dark, waiting for the moment when the light would finally shine on the truth instead of the facade. The silence of the basement wasn't empty. It was full of the data they ignored and the daughter they discarded. I had learned to thrive in the margins, finding a strange, bitter humor in their absolute certainty that I was nothing. They were so convinced of their own superiority that they never stopped to wonder why the girl they overlooked spent so much time on a flickering screen, or why she never complained about the cold. I was busy preparing for a future they couldn't conceive, a future where the names on the legal documents wouldn't be theirs but mine. As the years crawled by and the moisture seeped deeper into the wooden beams above me, I realized that the Franklin legacy wasn't being upheld by Spencer's charm or my father's money. It was being dismantled brick by the very person they thought was too weak to even stand. The weight of the battered suitcase in my hand that night was nothing compared to the absolute freezing cruelty in the eyes of my mother, Priscilla. It was the peak of a late summer hurricane season in Louisiana, and the sky had turned an ominous bruised shade of purple, breathing heavy gusts of wind that rattled the shutters of the Franklin estate like a warning. Inside the house, the atmosphere was even more volatile. I stood in the center of the lavish foyer, my damp clothes dripping onto the expensive Persian rug, while Franklin Sr. and Priscilla loomed over me like high judges of a kangaroo court. They weren't just angry, they were terrified. And, as the old saying goes, there is nothing more dangerous than a wealthy man staring at the ruins of his own reputation. The crisis had started only hours earlier, when Spencer stumbled through the door, his usual arrogant swagger replaced by a frantic, sweating panic. He had finally done it. The golden boy had lost over $80,000 of a private investor's money in a reckless scheme. The investor was a man who didn't care about the Franklin family name. He wanted his cash by dawn, or the authorities would be involved. Instead of letting Spencer face the consequences of his stupidity, Franklin Sr. had immediately turned his gaze toward the only thing of value left in the house that didn't belong to him. The offshore digital savings account I had painstakingly built over years of freelance data analysis and cybersecurity consulting. It was my ticket out of that basement, my hard-earned freedom fund, and they had found the access keys I kept hidden. "It's for the family, Jocelyn," Priscilla said, her voice trembling with a forced brittle sweetness that made my skin crawl. She was clutching her silk robe closed, her eyes darting toward the stairs where Spencer was hiding like a coward. "We've already transferred the funds to cover Spencer's little oversight. Surely you understand that your brother's future is worth more than a few numbers on a screen." I stared at her, my heart hammering against my ribs. They hadn't just stolen my money, they had eviscerated my future to save a man who couldn't even manage a lemonade stand without bankrupting it. When I refused to give them the final authorization code to clear the transaction, Franklin Sr. didn't argue. He simply stepped forward, his face flushed with rage, and grabbed my arm with a grip that left bruises for weeks. "You listen to me, you ungrateful little wretch," he hissed, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and desperation. "You've lived under this roof for 18 years, eating our food and breathing our air. You are a debt that we have been paying since the day you were born, broken. This money is the interest we are finally collecting." The sheer audacity of his statement was almost laughable. I was the one who had spent my teenage years fixing the family's accounting errors and cleaning up after Spencer's messes while they treated me like a ghost. In that moment, the last shred of familial loyalty I held within me withered and died. I looked at Franklin Sr. not as a father, but as a common thief, and I felt a cold, sharp clarity was over me. When I finally whispered the code only because the alternative was a physical altercation I couldn't win, Priscilla didn't offer a thank you or a hug. She simply exhaled a sigh of relief and nodded toward the door. "Now it's best if you leave," she said, her tone as casual as if she were dismissing a caterer. "With the legal heat Spencer is facing, we can't have any distractions. Your presence here has always been a liability, Jocelyn. We need to focus on protecting the heir of the Franklin legacy. You're smart. You'll find a way to survive on the streets. Isn't that what people like you do?" The people like you hit me harder than the theft. She meant the disabled, the unwanted, the broken parts of her social tapestry. The front door opened, and a wall of wind and rain slammed into the foyer. Franklin Sr. practically threw my suitcase onto the porch, the old leather cracking against the stone. I stood there, my spine aching and my leg trembling, watching my parents retreat into the warmth of their lit hallways. There was no goodbye, no "stay safe," just the heavy final thud of the deadbolt sliding into place. I was 18 years old, penniless, and standing in the middle of a literal hurricane because my brother needed to be saved from his own greed. It was a scenario so absurd, it could have been a scene from a dark comedy if the stakes weren't my survival. I remember looking at the darkened windows of the house and thinking that the storm outside was actually more welcoming than the people inside. I began to walk each step an agonizing battle against the wind. The rain was so thick I could barely see the end of the driveway, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The anger in my chest was like a furnace providing the only heat I had against the drenching cold. I had spent my life playing the role of the invisible victim, but as the Franklin estate faded into the gray mist behind me, I made a silent vow to the thunder. I wouldn't just survive, I would become the very storm that eventually leveled their ivory tower. They thought they had taken everything from me, but they had forgotten that I was the one who knew where all the financial secrets were buried. They had left a witness to their crimes out in the cold, and that was the biggest mistake Franklin Sr. ever made. By the time I reached the outskirts of the town, my clothes were plastered to my skin, and my limp was more pronounced than ever. I found a small abandoned bus shelter that offered a meager reprieve from the downpour. I sat on the cold metal bench clutching my suitcase and started to plan. My money was gone, but my brain was still intact, and my memory for data was perfect. Every transaction, every hidden debt, every lie my father had told on his tax returns was burned into my mind. I realized then that being imperfect in their eyes had given me the perfect cover to observe their true nature. As the lightning illuminated the swampy horizon, I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like a hunter who had finally been unleashed. The Franklin family thought they were protecting their legacy, but they had just signed its death warrant. Washington, D.C. is not a city designed for the weak or the sentimental. It is a sprawling marble labyrinth that devours those who cannot keep pace with its cold, calculated heartbeat. When I arrived at Union Station with nothing but a rain-damaged suitcase and a spine that felt like it was being scorched by a branding iron, I quickly realized that nobody cared about the Franklin legacy or my status as a discarded daughter. In this city, you are either the predator or the prey, and for the first 6 months, I was dangerously close to the latter. I worked 3 back-breaking jobs transcribing legal briefs in a windowless basement during the day, cleaning grease traps at a diner until midnight, and spending my few sleeping hours in a shared hostel room that smelled of cheap tobacco and unfulfilled dreams. But every spare cent I earned was funneled into one goal: gaining the credentials to enter the world of federal financial intelligence. I had learned to hide my limping leg behind the sharp professional silhouette of thrift store blazers, and I learned to hide my pain behind a mask of clinical indifference. My turning point came on a humid Tuesday afternoon at a public library where I was deep diving into the public filings of a suspicious shell company. I didn't notice the man standing behind me until he cleared his throat, a sharp, authoritative sound that broke my concentration. He was older, with hair the color of industrial steel and eyes that looked like they had seen every bribe and betrayal in the history of the Potomac. This was Logan Vance, a legendary figure in the financial crimes enforcement network, a man whose reputation for honesty was so fierce it was considered a liability by some politicians. He didn't ask for my name or my story. He simply pointed at a specific line in my spreadsheet and remarked, "You missed the secondary wire transfer routing in the Cayman accounts. It's disguised as a maritime insurance premium." I looked up, adjusted my glasses, and replied without missing a beat. "I didn't miss it, Mr. Vance. I'm just waiting for the clearinghouse timestamp to prove it's a wash sale." The flicker of respect that crossed his face in that moment was the first bit of warmth I had felt in years. Logan Vance didn't see a broken girl or a burden. He saw a mind that moved with the precision of a Swiss watch. Within a month, he had plucked me out of obscurity and placed me in an entry-level analyst position at FinCEN. He became the mentor I never had, a man who valued results over bloodlines and competence over charisma. He was the one who taught me that in the world of federal investigations, silence is a weapon and patience is a virtue. "Don't let them see you coming, Jocelyn," he would say, his voice like gravel grinding together. In this town, the person who speaks the loudest is usually the one with the most to hide. It was a lesson my brother Spencer had clearly never learned. As I climbed the ranks over the next few years, I spent my nights performing a very private, very thorough investigation, using the advanced forensic tools I now had at my disposal. I began to trace the financial trajectory of the Franklin family. What I found was a stomach-turning display of arrogance and criminality. Spencer hadn't just recovered from his little oversight in Louisiana. He had doubled down, building a massive fraudulent investment empire that targeted thousands of middle-class Americans. He was selling high-tech bonds that didn't exist, using a sophisticated scheme to fund a lifestyle of private jets and D.C. galas. He called himself a visionary in the press, but to me, he was just the same thieving coward who had hidden behind Priscilla's skirts while Franklin Sr. stole my savings. The irony was delicious. Every time Spencer boasted on social media about his new penthouse, he was essentially hand-delivering me a piece of evidence. Watching him from the shadows was like watching a man walk blindfolded toward a cliff of his own making. I found records of Spencer's shell companies, ingeniously named after various species of birds, a pretentious nod to his legal eagle nickname for me, routing millions of dollars through Dubai and Singapore. He was laundering money for international cartels, thinking he was too smart for the federal government to catch. I watched as my parents, Franklin Sr. and Priscilla, basked in his reflected glory, appearing in the background of his photos, with smiles that were as fake as their son's balance sheets. They truly believed they had won. They thought they had successfully pruned the imperfect branch of the family tree and replaced it with a golden bough. They had no idea that I was the one monitoring every code, every offshore deposit, and every panicked email Spencer sent when his liquidity began to dry up. It was during this period that Logan Vance approached my desk with a thick file labeled Operation Black Tide. He looked at me with a grim expression, one that carried a weight of fatherly concern he rarely showed. "This case just landed on the director's desk, Jocelyn," he said, tapping the folder. "It's big, it's international, and your brother is at the center of the web. I know the history, and I know why you recused yourself from the initial filing. But the director wants the best mind we have on the affidavit. That's you." I looked at the file, feeling the cold, familiar fury rising in my chest. For years, I had been the silent architect of my own survival, but now I was being asked to be the architect of their destruction. I took the file, my hand steady, and looked Logan in the eye. I'm ready, Logan. I've been ready for 8 years. He gave me a single sharp nod, the only validation I ever needed, and walked away. I didn't feel joy or excitement. I felt a sense of inevitable gravity. The Franklins thought they could throw me away like trash, but they had accidentally sent me to the only place in the world where I could learn how to dismantle them. I spent the next 72 hours in a windowless room connecting the final dots between Spencer's greed and the national security of the United States. I saw how he had compromised infrastructure to hide his tracks, a crime that carried a far heavier weight than simple fraud. The humor in the situation was dark and biting. While Priscilla was likely picking out new drapes for a house bought with stolen money, I was drafting the warrant that would turn her world into a crime scene. While Franklin Sr. was probably bragging at his club about his son's unparalleled success, I was documenting the exact moment that success became a federal felony. I had learned to hide my pain behind the cold logic of the law, and as I finished the final page of the 200-page affidavit, I realized that the girl they had kicked out into a hurricane was about to become the storm that blew their entire house down. Washington hadn't made me cruel. It had simply given me the tools to be just. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was seeking the final permanent record of the truth. Fate has a perverse way of playing with timing, placing me directly across from the architects of my misery in the heart of the capital, just 48 hours before their world was scheduled to incinerate. I was sitting in a high-end espresso bar near Capitol Hill, wearing a nondescript oversized trench coat over my federal suit, reviewing a digital manifest of Spencer's illicit offshore transfers. The air in the cafe was thick with the scent of roasted beans and the hushed tones of political power players, but that sanctuary was shattered when three people who looked like they had stepped out of a glossy brochure for the American dream arrived. There they were, Franklin Sr., Priscilla, and the golden boy himself, Spencer, looking as smug as a fox, who had just convinced the hens that the fence was for their own protection. They spotted me almost immediately. It's hard to stay invisible when the person looking at you has spent 18 years documenting your every perceived flaw. Priscilla was the first to approach, her heels clicking on the tile with a rhythmic aggression that signaled a lecture was imminent. She was draped in a cashmere wrap that probably cost more than my first year's rent in D.C., and her face was frozen in a mask of artificial sympathy. "Jocelyn, goodness, is that really you?" she exclaimed, her voice loud enough to draw glances from the surrounding tables. "We heard you had crawled up to Washington, but well, I expected you to at least be wearing something that didn't look like it came from a surplus bin. Are you still doing that little data entry hobby?" Franklin Sr. loomed behind her, his chest puffed out with the unearned confidence of a man who believed his son's stolen wealth was a reflection of his own superior genes. He didn't even offer a greeting. He simply stared at my sensible orthopedic shoes, the ones I wore to manage the dull ache in my spine, and let out a short, wheezing laugh. "Still hobbling along, I see," he remarked, his tone dripping with the kind of casual cruelty he usually reserved for failing employees. "It's a shame, really. Spencer was just telling us how he's being honored at a massive gala this week for his contributions to technology. It's a pity you can't see what a real career looks like, but I suppose someone has to fill the basements of this city." I sat there, my face a mask of polite professional indifference, though inside I was experiencing a dark electric amusement. Spencer stood a few paces back, adjusting his silk tie and checking his reflection. He looked at me with a smirk that was both patronizing and incredibly shallow. "Hey, Legal Eagle," he said, using the childhood nickname that always felt like a slap. "If you're still struggling to make ends meet, I might be able to find a spot for you in my new firm's filing department. We need someone who's used to sitting in the dark and not asking too many questions. I'll even pay you a sister's premium so you can buy a coat that actually fits." The irony was so thick I could almost taste it. Here was a man whose entire financial empire was currently being dismantled by my team, whose arrest warrant was sitting in a secure digital folder on my encrypted tablet, offering me a pity job in a company that wouldn't exist by Friday. Priscilla patted my hand, the touch cold and lifeless. "We're staying at the Ritz, dear," Spencer insisted. He said he couldn't have us staying anywhere that didn't have a 5-star rating. She bragged, her eyes darting toward my simple coffee cup as if it were a sign of abject poverty. "We're here for the honors ceremony. Spencer is a guest of honor, you know. He's achieved so much, and all without any physical setbacks to hold him back. It really shows what a Franklin can do when they are born whole." I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the silence stretch until they began to look uncomfortable. "I'm aware of the ceremony," I said, my voice low and steady. "It's going to be a very memorable event for everyone involved, perhaps even historic." Franklin Sr. barked a laugh, shaking his head at Priscilla. "Memorable for us, maybe. For you, it's just another day of being the invisible girl. Don't worry, Jocelyn will send you a signed program so you can see what you missed out on by being so difficult." He reached into his leather wallet, pulled out a $20 bill, and tossed it onto the table next to my laptop. "Get yourself a real lunch, kid, on Spencer's tab. Consider it a late graduation gift." They turned to leave, Spencer leading the way with the strut of a man who thought he owned the sidewalk, Priscilla clinging to his arm like he was a winning lottery ticket. I watched them walk away, their laughter echoing through the cafe, a hollow sound that carried the weight of their impending doom. They truly had no idea that the invisible girl they had just insulted was the one who had spent the last year mapping out every illegal cent they had ever touched. They thought they were in D.C. to witness a coronation. They didn't realize they were here to attend a funeral for their reputation. I looked down at the $20 bill lying on the table, a final pathetic insult from a man who was about to lose his mansion, his cars, and his pride. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel the need to shout or reveal my badge. The cold, professional fury I had carried since that night in the hurricane had evolved into a calm, predatory patience. I tucked the bill into my pocket. I would use it to buy a celebratory drink on Friday night after the handcuffs clicked shut. I reopened my tablet, the blue light reflecting in my glasses as I sent a quick encrypted message to Logan Vance. Subject: "The targets are in the city. Confirmed location: the Ritz. Proceed with final brief for Operation Black Tide." The humor in the situation was so dark it was almost Shakespearean. In 48 hours, Priscilla would find out that the 5-star hotel she was bragging about was being paid for with laundered money that the government had already frozen. Franklin Sr. would find out that his whole son was a hollow fraud whose only real talent was theft. And Spencer would finally learn that the legal eagle wasn't a nickname for a secretary. It was a description of the predator that had been circling his empire from above, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I finished my coffee, stood up without a sound, and walked out into the crisp D.C. air. My limp didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt like the steady, deliberate beat of a drum leading a march toward justice. The Franklins had spent my life treating me like a footnote, but I was about to read the final chapter of their story into the permanent record of the United States government. The double mahogany doors of the federal hearing room swung open with a heavy final thud, signaling the start of a session that would forever alter the Franklin family's destiny. The air inside was chilled to a precise clinical temperature, a stark contrast to the humid arrogance the Franklins had carried with them from Louisiana. As I walked down the center aisle, the sharp, disciplined click of my shoes was the only sound in the cavernous space. I wasn't the invisible girl from the basement today. I was Special Agent Jocelyn Franklin of the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, and the badge on my hip carried the full weight of the United States government. I didn't look toward the gallery, but I could feel their presence, Priscilla and Franklin Sr. were seated in the front row looking like they were at a royal coronation, while Spencer sat at a designated table, his face fixed in a smirk of unearned confidence. He likely still thought he was here to receive a leadership award. The gavel of the presiding director struck the block, a sound that cut through Spencer Franklin's manufactured smugness like a guillotine. The director, a man who had worked alongside Logan Vance for 3 decades, adjusted his glasses and looked out over the assembly with a face made of granite. "This hearing is now in session regarding Operation Black Tide," he announced, his voice booming. "We are here to review the evidence of high-level financial racketeering and national security breaches. The chair recognizes the lead investigator and architect of this entire operation." He paused, his gaze landing on me with a level of professional respect that I had never once received under my father's roof. "Special Agent Franklin, the floor is yours." The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of silence that precedes a tectonic shift. I stood up and walked to the podium, my movements steady and deliberate. As I adjusted the microphone, I finally allowed my eyes to drift toward my family. The transformation was instantaneous. Priscilla's hand flew to her throat, her expensive pearls rattling against her skin as her mouth hung open in a silent gasp of horror. Franklin Sr. looked as though he had been struck by a physical blow, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as he stared at the federal seal on my jacket. But it was Spencer whose reaction was most satisfying. His smirk didn't just fade, it disintegrated, replaced by raw, naked panic as the realization began to sink in. The girl he had mocked in a coffee shop only 2 days ago was now the one holding the keys to his prison cell. "Thank you, Director." I began, my voice clear and devoid of any emotional tremor. I clicked a button on the remote, and the massive projection screen behind me came to life with a complex web of codes, offshore bank manifests, and encrypted communications. For the past 18 months, my team has monitored a sophisticated money laundering network operating under the guise of Franklin Innovations. We have identified over $400 million in fraudulent transactions routed through shell corporations. I didn't look at Spencer as I spoke, but I could hear his heavy, ragged breathing from 10 feet away. I began to deconstruct his empire line by line, explaining how he had used Ponzi-style tactics to fleece middle-class retirees. The irony of the situation was a masterpiece of poetic justice. I used the very skills I had honed while hiding in that Louisiana basement: the data analysis, the pattern recognition, the sheer dogged persistence to dismantle the man they had chosen over me. I presented the recorded phone calls where Spencer laughed about his investors and the emails where he discussed donating to local officials to keep the heat off his back. At one point, I played a digital recording of a meeting Spencer had held 6 months ago. His voice filled the room, arrogant and loud. "Don't worry about the paperwork, the feds are too slow to catch a visionary like me. We're untouchable." The director leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he stared down at Spencer, who was now trembling so violently that his silk tie was vibrating against his chest. Priscilla made a small, strangled sound from the gallery, a desperate attempt to catch my eye, but I remained focused on the evidence. I wasn't there as her daughter. I was there as a witness for the people of the United States. I detailed the shell companies, the very ones Spencer had bragged about, and showed exactly how they were used to launder money for international cartels. The evidence wasn't just compelling, it was surgically precise. I had spent 8 years building my intellect like a weapon, and today I was finally firing it. The humor in the room was dark and biting. The high-priced lawyer Spencer had brought with him hadn't even opened his briefcase. He was staring at the screen with the defeated look of a man who knew his client was already underwater. In conclusion, I said, my gaze finally locking onto Spencer's terrified eyes, the investigation has confirmed that Spencer Franklin acted with full knowledge and malicious intent to defraud the public. Every asset associated with his name, as well as the names of his primary beneficiaries, has been traced back to these illicit activities. I watched as Franklin Sr. slumped back into his seat, the realization that his own retirement funds were likely caught in the crossfire beginning to dawn on him. They had thrown me away to protect Spencer's perfection, and in doing so, they had given me the vantage point to see every crack in his foundation. As I sat down, Logan Vance gave me a single slow nod of approval from the side of the room. It was the ultimate validation, far superior to any hollow praise my parents could have ever offered. The director struck his gavel once more, the sound echoing like a clap of thunder. Based on the evidence presented by Special Agent Franklin, this council finds sufficient cause to proceed with immediate federal detention. Marshals take the defendant into custody. Two burly U.S. Marshals stepped forward from the shadows of the doorway, their hands moving toward the handcuffs on their belts. The sound of the metallic ratchets clicking was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. It was the sound of 8 years of silence finally being broken by the roar of justice. Spencer looked like a ghost, his golden boy persona having evaporated into the clinical air, leaving behind only a small man who finally had to face the storm he had created. Their world did not end with a spectacular explosion. It collapsed with the cold, rhythmic, mechanical clicks of stainless steel handcuffs tightening around my brother's wrists. The sound echoed through the high vaulted ceiling of the hearing room, a sharp metallic punctuation mark at the end of the Franklin family's long sentence of arrogance. Spencer stood there, his expensive silk-lined shoulders slumped, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for a trapdoor. But there were no more exits. The two U.S. Marshals flanking him didn't care about his charisma. They handled him with the clinical efficiency of men who had seen 1,000 golden boys turn into lead before their eyes. The silence that had held the room captive suddenly broke into a chaotic symphony of desperation. Priscilla was the first to react, her polished facade finally shattering into jagged pieces. She lunged toward the bar, separating the gallery from the prosecution table, her hands clutching at the air. "Jocelyn, stop this! Tell them it's a mistake!" She shrieked, her voice reaching a pitch that set my teeth on edge. The refined socialite from Louisiana was gone, replaced by a woman whose entire identity was tied to the son she had used as a shield. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a frantic, watery hope that I found utterly grotesque. "You have the power, Jocelyn. Tell your directo that Spencer was confused. We are your family." Franklin Sr. was right behind her, his face a terrifying shade of crimson. He didn't plead. He commanded, even now in the ruins of his dignity. "Jocelyn Franklin, you listen to me?" He bellowed, his voice echoing with the ghost of the authority he used to wield. "You've made your point. Now pull these men off your brother before this goes any further. You're a Franklin, damn it. We don't air our laundry in a federal building." It was almost funny. In a dark, twisted way, he still believed that his paternal disapproval carried more weight than a federal warrant. He actually thought he could talk his way out of a national security case as if it were a speeding ticket. I stood my ground, my posture rigid, my expression a wall of professional stone. I didn't feel the urge to shout back. I simply looked at them not as a daughter but as a special agent concluding a long-term asset seizure. When I spoke, my voice was low, carrying a lethal, quiet authority that silenced their outbursts. "Mr. Franklin, Mrs. Priscilla, you are under a grave misunderstanding," I said, addressing them by the names I had assigned them in my heart years ago. "I am not here to negotiate. I am here to execute the law. And the law doesn't care about your dinner parties or your family tree." I reached into my leather brief and pulled out a fresh stack of documents, each bearing the heavy seal of the Department of Justice. The sound of the paper sliding across the mahogany table was like a whisper of fate. "This is a civil asset forfeiture warrant," I announced, my gaze shifting from my parents to the lead marshal. "Under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the federal government is moving to seize all assets derived from or used to facilitate the criminal activities of Spencer Franklin. This includes the estate in Louisiana, the condominiums in Washington and New York, all vehicles and every domestic bank account currently held in the names of Franklin Sr. and Priscilla Franklin. The reaction was instantaneous and visceral. Priscilla actually stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth. "The house," she whispered, her voice cracking with a sudden sharp terror. "The Louisiana house. Everything in it. All my things." She looked around the room, realizing for the first time that the luxury she had used to belittle me was being liquidated to pay for the crimes of her favorite child. Franklin Sr. was speechless, his jaw working silently as he processed the fact that he was quite literally being stripped of his kingdom. He had spent his life building a fortress of status, and I had just handed the keys to the federal government. "You can't do that." Spencer stammered his first words since the handcuffs snapped shut. His voice was thin and reedy. "That's their home, Jocelyn. You're making them homeless. You're a monster." I finally looked him directly in the eye, and for a fleeting second the legal eagle they had mocked came out to play. "I'm not the one who laundered money through a shell company, Spencer," I replied, my tone as cold as a D.C. winter. "I'm not the one who took out a second mortgage on our parents' home to fund a lifestyle of lies. You did that. I'm just the one who documented the receipts." The marshals began to lead Spencer away, his heels dragging slightly on the carpet, a pathetic mirror of the limp he had spent my entire life ridiculing. As he passed the gallery, Franklin Sr. reached out to touch his arm, but a marshal firmly blocked him. "Move back, sir," the officer commanded, a tone of steel that broke Franklin Sr.'s spirit once and for all. He slumped into the front row bench, a hollow shell of a man watching the golden boy disappear through the side doors. Priscilla followed them to the exit, sobbing into her cashmere wrap, a garment that would likely be in a federal evidence locker by the end of the week. I turned back to my table and began to methodically pack my files. Logan Vance walked over, standing beside me in a silent show of support. "You did your job, Agent Franklin," he said quietly, his eyes following the retreating forms of my family. "Most people would have broken under that kind of pressure. You stayed focused." I nodded, the tension in my shoulders finally beginning to ebb away. "I was broken a long time ago, Logan," I replied, a small, tired smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. "Everything I've done since then has been about putting the pieces back together in a way that actually works." I watched the court reporter finish her transcript, knowing that every word I had spoken today was now a permanent, unchangeable record of the truth. My parents had spent my life writing a narrative where I was a mistake, a footnote to Spencer's greatness. But today I had rewritten the ending. The Franklins weren't a dynasty. They were a cautionary tale, and I was the one who had finally closed the book. As I walked toward the exit, I saw the $20 bill Franklin Sr. had tossed at me in the cafe, still sitting in the side pocket of my bag. I took it out, looked at it for a moment, and then dropped it into the donation box for the Federal Marshal's Benevolent Fund near the door. It was the last thing I would ever take from them, and it felt remarkably light. When I stepped out of the federal building, the late afternoon sun was high, casting long golden shadows across the stone steps of Washington, D.C. For the first time in 8 years, perhaps, the first time in my entire life, I felt my spine was perfectly straight, unburdened by the crushing weight of the Franklin family's expectations or their disdain. As I reached the sidewalk, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out to see a frantic string of missed calls and a long, rambling voicemail from an unrecognized number in Louisiana. It was Priscilla, her voice high and desperate, weeping about family blood and misunderstandings, begging me to use my influence to save their house. I didn't listen to the end. I didn't feel a flicker of guilt or a surge of anger. I simply felt a profound, quiet emptiness where their importance used to be. I deleted the message, blocked the number, and watched as the screen went blank. The branch had finally been pruned, and for the first time the tree was healthy. A few months later, the federal government awarded me a significant commendation bonus for my role in Operation Black Tide, a sum of money that would have seemed like an impossible fortune to the girl sleeping in the flooded basement. I didn't buy a luxury car or a penthouse to rival Spencer's former glory. Instead, I used every cent to establish the Rising Light Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to providing advanced technology and educational scholarships for children born with physical disabilities. I wanted to ensure that no child would ever have to believe they were broken just because they didn't fit someone else's definition of perfection. Every time I see a student walk into our center with their head held high, I know that my journey through the storm was worth every painful step. There was no grand reconciliation, no tearful apology accepted over a holiday dinner. The Franklins had to learn the hard way that a legacy built on theft and vanity is nothing more than a house of cards. Spencer is currently serving his 15-year sentence in a federal penitentiary, and Franklin Sr. and Priscilla are living in a modest apartment far away from the social circles that once fueled their egos. People often ask me if I regret being so cold, if I should have shown them mercy. My answer is always the same. Mercy is for those who seek to change, not for those who only seek to escape the consequences of their actions. I didn't destroy my family. I simply allowed the truth to finish the job they started when they kicked me out. The greatest lesson I've learned is that your value is not a gift granted by others. It is a monument you build for yourself in the silence of your own struggle. To anyone listening who has ever been told they are a burden, a mistake, or a footnote in someone else's story, believe in your own intellect, trust your own resilience, and never be afraid to be the architect of your own justice. You are not defined by the basement you came from, but by the heights you are brave enough to reach. Thank you so much for joining me on this long and difficult journey of truth. Your support means everything to me and helps ensure that stories of justice and resilience continue to be told. If this story resonated with you, please leave a comment below sharing your own experiences. I read every single one. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who might need a reminder of their own strength. Stay healthy, stay strong, and remember, your worth is always recognized here.